For weeks now, there's been a growing chorus of voices suggesting that if a ceasefire were declared in Ukraine, temporary or lasting, that democratic elections could swiftly follow. It's an idea publicly endorsed by both Russia and the United States. But is it really that simple? What does it actually take to organise a national election in a country at war? How long would it take to ensure voters can participate safely and that the result carries legitimacy, both at home and abroad? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question, can you pause a war long enough to cast ballots and then simply press play again? These are the questions that few seem to ask. So today we're going to do just that. And to do so, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Ben Graham-Jones, an expert on democratic resilience who's observed or provided support to 40 plus elections across the globe, including multiple Ukrainian ones. Ben, welcome. Thank you very much for your time. First of all, let's just start with a very basic question of how difficult is it to hold elections at the moment in Ukraine?
Well, Francis, I think some of the phrases I would use would be extremely challenging, highly risky, just about the most difficult electoral challenge I would have seen in any democracy to organise a wartime election right now in Ukraine. An election is not something you can just rustle up quickly. And I think we need to actually think about what that would entail. First of all, you've got the legal challenges. So Ukraine, understandably, is under martial law, which enables Ukraine to take the measures to defend itself. And under the law as it stands, of course, that means that Ukraine cannot hold elections under the current situation. Now, martial law is renewed by the democratically elected representatives every 90 days. So that's if we put those legal issues to one side, which we can't really do, we come to the logistical problems. You've got 20% of the country occupied. You've got 4 million IDPs, people who are internally displaced, 1 million Ukrainians in active service, millions of refugees abroad. The need to secure, if we go on the 2019 figures, about 30,000 polling stations, it would be, probably more by now. And then you've got to transport the election materials and the ballots and everything else across infrastructure that has been, of course, subject to intense bombing. Now, on top of that, you're asking voters to go to the polling station in a hypothetical ceasefire, and I'm not sure that anybody trusts Russia to respect that ceasefire, posing massive security challenges really at every level. So, look, ultimately elections will happen in Ukraine. There are 7 parliamentary committees which are looking into the many complex issues right now. But I don't think when it comes to wartime elections, we should do anything here to minimize just how complex and challenging a task this would be.
So if we were just to hypothetically imagine a scenario, Ben, where, and I think this is extremely unlikely, but this is an argument that has been put forward, so we have to address it. There were a ceasefire that were temporarily arranged so that an election could take place. How long a run-in would you need to prepare for an election of this complexity?
It depends how good you want the election to be. What matters is not just holding elections. What matters is credible elections. You need to make sure that there are so many chapters which would need to be addressed here, and Ukraine is addressing these. They are looking into all of the different intersecting challenges, but this isn't something that you could just do in months. And I think sometimes, really, when an argument is made, we need to think about not only the argument, but why is it being put forward? And in essence, the idea that Ukraine now needs to immediately go to some sort of rushed elections, which would have all sorts of challenges, is really a trap. It's an attempt, in essence, I think, by Russia to make an argument that really resonates not just with its usual audiences for its information operations, but also to people who can hear that and go, well, actually, yes, Ukraine should have elections if it's a democracy. Maybe Russia's got a point there, but let's not fall into that trap. Russia has elections. Cameroon has elections. Burkina Faso has elections. What matters is not elections, but credible elections. And that's not something that you can do in weeks or months. Let's remember that the suspension of the election cycle was not Ukraine's choice. This was something that Russia did by invading, thus mandating the imposition of martial law. And in the meantime, hey, let's look at what's happening to Ukrainian democracy. Let's look at the fact that opposition parties and voices frequently criticize the government and the media, the high-profile anti-corruption efforts that are underway, the civil society groups that are as active as ever. So I think we need some moral clarity on this.
Well, you say this is a trap, and I think we all know what Russia is seeking to do with this policy, but why do you think that the US is so keen on this from your perspective?
Well, that's a good question, Francis, and I think the reasons why the US has promoted this narrative are perhaps not entirely clear. Maybe the day will come when it is a little bit more clear. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that if rushed elections are widely perceived as illegitimate, it does become easier for Russia to destabilize the Ukrainian state. Let's remember, Russia has failed to achieve its military goals here. Now, the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz once wrote that war is politics by other means, and I think we can guarantee that for Russia, Ukrainian elections would be war by other means. So I would be very careful about the idea of elections, and at the very least, we can't minimize just how serious a challenge that would be.
Do you think President Trump wants to get rid of Zelensky and have somebody else who might be a little bit more amenable to his way of thinking?
Well, I think there's certainly may well be an element of that. From Russia's perspective, of course, they definitely want rid of Zelensky. I think we have to see this from the perspective of Putin's inner circle, for whom Zelensky's very existence is a reminder that Putin doesn't always achieve his aims. A reminder that Russia can be pushed back on. A reminder that resistance against Putin is actually possible and can succeed. And for an autocrat, that's extremely dangerous. From the US side, of course, I don't know. I can't look inside President Trump's head and see his motivations. But certainly, I think we've all seen there doesn't seem to be any love lost between President Trump and President Zelensky.
You've spoken about how challenging this would be. I think incomparably challenging would be one way of putting it, in trying to arrange an election which you don't even have clarity on what the franchise is going to be. Are you going to try and include people in the occupied territories in this, which Ukraine, of course, because of the argument that this is still sovereign Ukrainian territory, they might try and find some way in which people can vote there. And that's been something that I've read raised in the Ukrainian press, which of course would be almost impossible to do. So I think you've underscored that aspect. But let's say that a day does come in short order where an election is possible in Ukraine. What does the West, what does Britain, what do countries that call themselves Ukraine's allies need to do to ensure that there is a safe election from Russian interference?
Well, I think we need to remember that there was a time when Russia was known for chess and for its figure skating and for its classical music, was a world leader in all of these aspects. And right now in 2026, Russia is a world leader in election interference. So this is we can imagine that when an election takes place, Russia will do everything possible to subvert Ukraine's democratic institutions, to try to compromise the process. Now, for the West and for the UK, one thing to bear in mind is that at that election, this will be the very front line of the very latest tactics and techniques that Russia uses, and they don't just use these in Ukraine to subvert democracy. So, one of the things that I see in my work is that if you want to secure an election, it's not just about looking inwards at your own vulnerabilities, but it's about looking at how other countries, the tactics that are used in those contexts, because that's how you learn about how the threat evolves. So whether these elections in Ukraine arrive in months or years, they will expose Russian electoral interference at its most well-resourced, at its most ambitious, and yes, it may expose tactics that later get deployed here at home. One thing I would add to that, Francis, is that I would draw inspiration from the way that across the Indo-Pacific, countries have looked to Taiwan to understand how the PRC's democratic interference works, and to understand the very latest tactics, techniques, approaches that China deploys. And so, countries like the Philippines have tried to learn from that. And I think that we need to be doing the same when the Ukrainian elections come along. This is not just a matter of supporting our ally to hold a free and fair and credible democratic process. It's also about helping the wider democratic community ensure that our own institutions and elections are free and fair in the long run.
Hi, Ben. It's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. Election interference, you've just been mentioning there. How does that take place, and how do monitors spot it? Because surely the days of having some hood outside the ballot box saying, make sure you vote for party X or Y, here's $20. I don't know if that still goes on, but I mean, it's a bit more sophisticated than that, I would imagine. So how do you spot it?
Well, I have to say, Dom, I've definitely seen that sort of thing taking place in some of the places I've worked. But as you can imagine, nowadays it's a lot more advanced. And there's a great article I would encourage listeners to read by Andy Price at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, who says, I can buy a UK election for $25 million. And he outlines a range of the tactics that Russia uses, whether it's funneling cryptocurrency to particular politicians, whether it's deploying bots across social media to promote certain narratives, whether it's payments to influencers in order that they can try to divide people. And sometimes it's not even about them trying to support a particular candidate. It can just be about trying to divide a society, trying to turn people against each other so that people have the sense that democracy doesn't work. And it's precisely because their strategy is so whole society, they can target, they try to target election commissions, political parties, the education system, all of us when we go on social media. It's precisely because of that the right response must also be whole society. It involves institutions at every level right now, learning from what's happening in Ukraine, learning from what's happening in other places like Moldova, where Russia has targeted for its interference, and bringing those lessons back home.
Yeah, there was that amazing footage from our colleague at the BBC, Sarah Rainsford, who was in Moldova a couple of years ago, and she just happened to be at a polling station and was outside with her camera team, and they saw this woman wandering around saying, "Where do I get my money?" And Sarah went up and spoke to her and said, "What are you talking about, madam?" And she said she'd been given like $10 before the vote, and she was told she'd get another $20 afterwards. And Sarah did this amazing story about Russian election interference in Moldova. So I think that's sort of on the low end, the shallow water end of this kind of stuff. But it must be. I mean, how after the event, how can you see the results if it's all closed, if the ballot boxes are closed and the votes are all taken away? How can you then get a view afterwards as to why constituency over there had a sweeping move in one party's favour? Because you don't actually get to see. That's the whole point about having a sort of legitimate election, is that you don't get to see the vote. So how are you able to gather the data, the evidence to put these assertions afterwards?
Right. So this is exactly why, Dom, it's so important to act early. Okay, to be prepared, because an election, we tend to think of it as just a sort of a one-day thing. We turn up, we vote, we put we put it in the ballot box, and then there we go. We hear the result. But actually, these types of techniques that authoritarian countries deploy are much longer term than that. We need to be looking at the funding of political parties. We need to be looking at payments that are made to influencers. We need to be looking at online advertising. We need to be looking at all of these different aspects that actually help influence the way that an election goes. Because if we only start to act once the election's over, well, it's sort of too late very often. So this is why we really need to have that longer term perspective, and why right now we need to be thinking about the long arch of democracy, not just in Ukraine, but in all of our democratic societies.
Ben, zooming out a little bit from Ukraine and the European context, I know you're also an expert on what Russia and China have sought to do in Africa with regards to hybrid warfare and manipulating elections and the information space. I wonder if you can just comment on the kind of examples that you've seen, particularly of Russia, but China too, where relevant, of manipulating democracy in those countries.
Yeah, it's really ambitious, insidious. And in multiple contexts, you have, especially in Africa, you have governments in place who were installed with the support of Russian arms, of Russian information operations. It varies depending on the country. But I'll give one example, for example, of a tactic that China uses. And they do something that's often called constructive journalism. And they will send journalists, up-and-coming journalists in countries, not just in Africa, but across the globe, but especially on the African continent. And they will get these all-expenses-paid visits to China. And the aim of these visits really is so that people start to see journalism less about asking questions and more about relaying official information. Now, these sort of long-term processes of co-optation, which often comes alongside buying up the media landscape through various fronts, and then of course you've got the influence on the telecommunications infrastructure, etc., comes in very helpful when you need to impose an internet shutdown during an election. You put that all together, and you realise that the election interference didn't just appear overnight, but it took years and years to put together. So those are the sorts of tactics that we see. They are extremely ambitious, and we also see that Russia, China, and authoritarian regimes are working ever more closely to undertake these operations.
Well, the last time you were in London, Ben, you and I caught up, and you showed me a video of the kind of information dissemination that Moscow carries out in Africa. And it sounds like I'm oversimplifying this, and in a sense I am, but also I'm not, because the narrative is literally, and this is not an exaggeration, it was a video for children mainly and young people designed to have countries resembled by animals. So of course Russia is the bear. I think you'd have to remind me, Ben, which African country this was, but that was resembled by, I think, the lion, and then the Western countries were hyenas, and you can see where this is going, right? This idea that Western countries have stripped Africa bare in its past, colonization, etc., etc. And Russia, the bear, comes literally in the video, comes across the world to help defend from the hyenas. And this is the kind of propaganda that is pushed into Russia. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more, Ben, about that and the audiences it's designed for and the impact that it has.
Yes, Francis, that was a video from the Central African Republic targeted at children. And ultimately, it's important to understand that, because we wouldn't necessarily think of children as people who might be targeted with election interference, right? Because they can't vote. But actually, these what we call hybrid threats are part of a broader package of trying to influence and co-opt countries, these infringements on their sovereignty. And so we need to understand election interference as something that's going on over multi-years process. And when you look at the particular strategies that both Russia and China use, they are thinking on these timescales very often. Of course, Russia's disinformation, for example, to try to harm the Ukrainian-Polish bilateral relationship, for example, has got a decades-long history. China's operations in Africa have a decades-long history. So these aren't things that just emerge overnight, but these authoritarian regimes have the resources to invest over the long run. And unfortunately, too often, democratic states don't invest in building that democratic resilience, and we're left vulnerable when election day arrives.
Well, we'll try and link to that extraordinary video. It's worth watching in full just to see exactly the kind of information warfare that is carried out in Africa. But let's go to our final thoughts now then. And of course, we'll end with you, Ben, and to touch on anything that we've not talked about. But Dom, where would you like to leave listeners today?
Might be a little bit UK-centric, but we hear today that Britain is going to be sending a Type 45 destroyer, probably HMS Duncan, I think, one of the 6 Type 45s we have, to Cyprus. This comes after Sunday night's drone strike on RAF Akrotiri, the British airbase, and Cyprus. So surely that's a little bit too late. If you're going to send it now, you should have sent it before. What's Britain got in terms of air defence? Not a huge amount. We hear a lot about anti-drone jammers and anti-drone technology and lasers. There's going to be dragon fire on ships next year, laser to shoot down drones. So we hear a lot about all this stuff, but actually you've got one of Britain's premier air bases in one of the most volatile regions of the world, RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus, and a drone, a slow, low drone, manages to get through whatever air defence there was and hits the ground. I mean, that's just extraordinary, and I just use that as an example to, I'm quite pessimistic of late, and I think that as an example of European sort of foot dragging. I mean,
daddling.
4 years since the start of the full-scale invasion, the huge investment Britain and others, many others, Germany hugely, into Ukraine. We've all talked about drones until it's bored us all to tears, and then we start again, and yet Britain now has a drone landing at RAF Akrotiri and going a week later, better send a boat. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Where's we hear so much about lessons learned, lessons identified. It's like, what lessons did you need? You had 4 years to get ready for this, to prepare. I mean, it's not as if Iran as a threat was suddenly sprung up last week, and yet we're unprepared. We don't have something that can bring down a drone. RAF Akrotiri. I just worry that Europeans are not really not taking this seriously. There's too many. I'm not saying Britain is here, but I think there's too many people across Europe just hoping this problem goes away, and then we don't really have to worry about investing in defence and all the rest of it, because we are left here 4 years after the start of the full-scale invasion. A single drone gets through whatever air defence there was at RAF Akrotiri, and 5 days later, or whatever it's 4 days later, we decide to send a boat.
I don't think that's
ship.
too...
I know it's a ship, I know it's boats under the water, ships above the water, but
But Ben, as our guest, where would you like to leave listeners today?
We should be under no illusions about how difficult it will be to hold early Ukrainian elections. Let's look back at history. We've only got a few examples of when something like this has been attempted, right? And you had Greece's chaotic civil war election of 1946, Iraq's sectarian election of 2005, which just made everything, which created all manner of problems. Repeated attempts to hold a democratic election without the preconditions in place in Somalia, the abandoned efforts, Palestinian elections in 2021. I've heard the example put of Lincoln's election in 1864 during the Civil War.
I think I'm guilty of talking about that one, Ben.
I mean, well, I don't know if the OSCE or the Carter Center or the EU observers were there for that one, but I think with all respect to our American friends, it was a pretty disastrous election from a technical standpoint. So we need to be really careful about this. We need to note that it's highly, highly challenging to hold an election under the current conditions, and we need to think about who's making an argument and why they're making it.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your time today. Thank you, Dom. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
For more from the Ukraine the Latest team, sign up to our weekly email newsletter. You'll get exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights from me and Dom, plus answers to your questions. Scan the QR code to sign up for free today.